Section 40 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 3 by Gaston MASPERO. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 3 Chaldaean Civilization, Part 13. The number of astronomical facts with which the Chaldeans had made themselves acquainted was considerable. It was a question in ancient times whether they or the Egyptians had been the first to carry their investigations into the infinite depths of celestial space. When it came to be a question as to which of the two peoples had made greater progress in this branch of knowledge, all hesitation vanished, and the preeminence was accorded by the ancients to the priests of Babylon, rather than to those of Heliopolis and Memphis. The Chaldean priests had been accustomed from an early date to record on their clay tablets the aspect of the heavens and the changes which took place in them night after night, the appearance of the constellations, their comparative brilliancy, the precise moments of their rising and setting and culmination, together with the more or less rapid movements of the planets, and their motions towards or from one another. To their unaided eyes, sharpened by practice and favoured by the transparency of the air, many stars were visible, as to the Egyptians, which we can perceive only by the aid of the telescope. Those thousands of brilliant bodies, scattered apparently at random over the face of the sky, moved, however, with perfect regularity, and the period between their departure from and their return to the same point in the heavens was determined at an early date. Their position could be predicted at any hour, their course in the firmament being traced so accurately that its various stages were marked out and indicated beforehand. The moon, they discovered, had to complete 223 revolutions of 29 days and a half each, before it returned to the point from which it had set out. This period of its career being accomplished, it began a second of equal length, then a third, and so on, in an infinite series, during which it traversed the same celestial houses and repeated in them the same acts of its life. All the eclipses which it had undergone in one period would again afflict it in another, and would be manifest in the same places of the earth in the same order of time. Whether they ascribed these eclipses to some mechanical cause, or regarded them as so many unfortunate attacks made upon sin by the seven, they recognized their periodical character, and they were acquainted with the system of the 223 lunations by which their occurrence and duration could be predicted. Further observations encouraged the astronomers to endeavour to do for the sun what they had so successfully accomplished in regard to the moon. No long experience was needed to discover the fact that the majority of solar eclipses were followed some 14 days and a half after by an eclipse of the moon, but they were unable to take sufficient advantage of this experience to predict with certainty the instant of a future eclipse of the sun, although they had been so struck with the connection of the two phenomena as to believe that they were in a position to announce it approximately. They were frequently deceived in their predictions, and more than one eclipse which they had promised did not take place at the time expected, but their successful prognostications were sufficiently frequent to console them for their failures, and to maintain the respect of the people and the rulers for their knowledge. Their years were vague years of 360 days. The 12 equal months of which they were composed bore names which were borrowed, on the one hand, from events in civil life, such as Simanu from the making of brick, and Adaru from the sowing of seed, and on the other, from mythological occurrences whose origin is still obscure, such as Nisanu from the altar of Ea, and Ulul from a message of Ishtar. The adjustment of this year to astronomical demands was roughly carried out by the addition of a month every 6 years, which was called a second Adar, Blul, or Nisan, according to the place in which it was intercalated. The neglect of the hours and minutes in their calculation of the length of the year became with them, as with the Egyptians, a source of serious embarrassment, and we are still ignorant as to the means employed to meet the difficulty. The months had relations to the signs of the zodiac, and the days composing them were made up of 12 double hours each. The Chaldeans had invented 2 instruments, both of them of a simple character, to measure time, the clepsydra and the solar clock, the latter of which in later times became the source of the Greek polos. The sundial served to determine a number of simple facts which were indispensable in astronomical calculations, such as the 4 cardinal points, the meridian of the place, the solstitial and equinoctial epochs, and the elevation of the pole at the position of observation. The construction of the sundial and clepsydra, if not the polos also, is doubtless to be referred back to a very ancient date, but none of the text already brought to light makes mention of the employment of these instruments. All these discoveries, which constitute in our eyes the scientific patrimony of the Chaldeans, were regarded by themselves as the least important results of their investigations. Did they not know, thanks to these investigations, that the stars shone for other purposes than to lighten up the nights, to rule, in fact, the destinies of men and kings, and in ruling that of kings, to determine the fortune of empires? Their earliest astronomers, by their assiduous contemplation of the nightly heavens, had come to the conclusion that the vicissitudes of the heavenly bodies were in fixed relations with mundane phenomena and events. If Mercury, for instance, displayed an unusual brilliancy at his rising, and his disk appeared as a two-edged sword, riches and abundance, due to the position of the luminous halo which surrounded him, would be scattered over Chaldea, while discords would cease therein, and justice would triumph over iniquity. The first observer who was struck by this coincidence noted it down; his successors confirmed his observations, and at length deduced, in the process of the years, from their accumulated knowledge, a general law. Henceforward, each time that Mercury assumed the same aspect, it was a favourable augury, and kings and their subjects became the recipients of his bounty. As long as he maintained this appearance no foreign ruler could install himself in Chaldea; tyranny would be divided against itself, equity would prevail, and a strong monarch bear sway, while the landholders and the king would be confirmed in their privileges, and obedience, together with tranquillity, would rule everywhere in the land. The number of these observations increased to such a degree that it was found necessary to classify them methodically to avoid confusion. Tables of them were drawn up, in which the reader could see at one and the same moment the aspect of the heavens on such and such a night and hour, and the corresponding events either then happening or about to happen in Chaldea, Syria, or some foreign land. If, for instance, the moon displayed the same appearance on the 1st and 27th of the month, Elam was threatened; but if the sun at his setting appears double his usual size, with 3 groups of bluish rays, the king of Chaldea is ruined. To the indications of the heavenly bodies, the Chaldeans added the portents which could be deduced from atmospheric phenomena. If it thundered on the 27th of Tammuz, the wheat harvest would be excellent and the produce of the ears magnificent; but if this should occur 6 days later, that is, on the 2nd of Abu, floods and rains were to be apprehended in a short time, together with the death of the king and the division of his empire. It was not for nothing that the sun and moon surrounded themselves in the evening with blood-red vapours, or veiled themselves in dark clouds; that they grew suddenly pale or red after having been intensely bright; that unexpected fires blazed out on the confines of the air; and that on certain nights the stars seemed to have become detached from the firmament and to be falling upon the earth. These prodigies were so many warnings granted by the gods to the people and their kings before great crises in human affairs. The astronomer investigated and interpreted them, and his predictions had a greater influence than we are prepared to believe upon the fortunes of individuals and even of states. The rulers consulted and imposed upon the astronomers the duty of selecting the most favourable moment for the execution of the projects they had in view. From an early date each temple contained a library of astrological writings, where the people might find, drawn up, as in a code, the signs which bore upon their destinies. One of these libraries, consisting of not less than 70 clay tablets, is considered to have been first drawn up in the reign of Sargon of Agade, but to have been so modified and enriched with new examples from time to time that the original is well nigh lost. This was the classical work on the subject in the 7th century before our era, and the astronomers, royal, to whom applications were accustomed to be made to explain a natural phenomenon or a prodigy, drew their answers ready-made from it. Astronomy, as thus understood, was not merely the queen of sciences, it was the mistress of the world, taught secretly in the temples; its adepts, at least those who had passed through the regular curriculum of study which it required, became almost a distinct class in society. The occupation was a lucrative one, and its accomplished professors had numerous rivals whose educational antecedents were unknown, but who excited the envy of the experts in their trading upon the credulity of the people. These quacks went about the country drawing up horoscopes, and arranging schemes of birthday prognostications, of which the majority were without any authentic warranty. The law sometimes took note of the fact that they were competing with the official experts, and interfered with their business; but if they happened to be exiled from one city, they found some neighbouring one ready to receive them. End of Section 40. Read by Professor Heather and By. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Section 41 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 3 by Gaston MASPERO. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 3. Chaldaean Civilization, Part 14. Chaldea abounded with soothsayers and necromancers no less than with astrologers. She possessed no real school of medicine, such as we find in Egypt, in which were taught rational methods of diagnosing maladies and of curing them by the use of simples. The Chaldeans were content to confide the care of their bodies to sorcerers and exorcists, who were experts in the art of casting out demons and spirits, whose presence in a living being brought about those disorders to which humanity is prone. The facial expression of the patient during the crisis, the words which escaped him in delirium, were, for these clever individuals, so many signs revealing the nature and sometimes the name of the enemy to be combated: the fever god, the plague god, the headache god. Consultations and medical treatment were, therefore, religious offices, in which were involved purifications, offerings, and a whole ritual of mysterious words and gestures. The magician lighted a fire of herbs and sweet-smelling plants in front of his patient, and the clear flame arising from this put the spectres to flight, and dispelled the malign influences, a prayer describing the enchantments and their effects being afterwards recited. The baleful imprecation, like a demon, has fallen upon a man. Wail and pain have fallen upon him, direful wail has fallen upon him, the baleful imprecation, the spell, the pains in the head. This man, the baleful imprecation slaughters him like a sheep, for his god has quitted his body, his goddess has withdrawn herself in displeasure from him, a wail of pain has spread himself as a garment upon him and has overtaken him. The harm done by the magician, though terrible, could be repaired by the gods, and Merodach was moved to compassion betimes. Merodach cast his eyes on the patient. Merodach entered into the house of his father Ea, saying, "My father, the baleful curse has fallen like a demon upon the man." Twice he thus speaks, and then adds, "What this man ought to do I know not. How shall he be healed?" Ea replies to his son Merodach, "My son, what is there that I could add to thy knowledge?" "Merodach, what is there that I could add to thy knowledge? That which I know thou knowest it. Go then, my son Merodach, lead him to the house of purification of the god who prepares remedies, and break the spell that is upon him, draw away the charm which is upon him, the ill which afflicts his body, which he suffers by reason of the curse of his father, or the curse of his mother, or the curse of his eldest brother, or by the curse of a murderess who is unknown to the man. The curse, may it be taken from him by the charm of Ea, like a clove of garlic, which is stripped skin by skin, like a cluster of dates may it be cut off, like a bunch of flowers may it be uprooted. The spell, may heaven avert it, may the earth avert it." The god himself deigned to point out the remedy. The sick man was to take a clove of garlic, some dates, and a stalk bearing flowers, and was to throw them into the fire bit by bit, repeating appropriate prayers at each stage of the operation. In like manner as this garlic is peeled and thrown into the fire, and the burning flame consumes it, as it will never be planted in the vegetable garden, it will never draw moisture from the pond or from the ditch, its root will never again spread in the earth, its stalk will not pierce the ground and behold the sun, it will not serve as food for the gods or the king, so may it remove the baleful curse, so may it loose the bond of sickness, of sin, of shortcomings, of perversity, of crime. The sickness which is in my body, in my flesh, in my muscles, like this garlic may it be stripped off, and may the burning flame consume it in this day. May the spell of the sorcerer be cast out, that I may behold the light. The ceremony could be prolonged at will. The sick person pulled to pieces the cluster of dates, the bunch of flowers, a fleece of wool, some goat's hair, a skein of dyed thread, and a bean, which were all in turn consumed in the fire. At each stage of the operation he repeated the formula, introducing into it one or two expressions characterizing the nature of the particular offering, as, for instance, the dates will no more hang from their stalks, the leaves of the branch will never again be united to the tree, The wool and the hair will never again lie on the back of the animal on which they grew, and will never be used for weaving garments. The use of magical words was often accompanied by remedies, which were for the most part both grotesque and disgusting in their composition. They comprised bitter or stinking wood shavings, raw meat, snake's flesh, wine, and oil, the whole reduced to a pulp, or made into a sort of pill and swallowed on the chance of its bringing relief. The Egyptian physicians employed similar compounds, to which they attributed wonderful effects, but they made use of them in exceptional circumstances only. The medical authorities in Chaldea recommended them before all others, and their very strangeness reassured the patient as to their efficacy. They filled the possessing spirits with disgust, and became a means of relief owing to the invincible horror with which they inspired the persecuting demons. The Chaldeans were not, however, ignorant of the natural virtues of herbs, and at times made use of them, but they were not held in very high esteem, and the physicians preferred the prescriptions which pandered to the popular craving for the supernatural. Amulets further confirmed the effect produced by the recipes, and prevented the enemy, once cast out, from re-entering the body. These amulets were made of knots of cord, pierced shells, bronze or terracotta statuettes, and plaques fastened to the arms or worn round the neck. On each of the latter kind were roughly drawn the most terrible images that they could conceive. A shortened incantation was scrawled on its surface, or it was covered with extraordinary characters, which, when the spirits perceived, they at once took flight, and the possessor of the talisman escaped the threatened illness. However laughable, and at the same time deplorable, this hopeless medley of exact knowledge and gross superstition may appear to us at the present day, it was the means of bringing a prosperity to the cities of Chaldea which no amount of actual science would ever have produced. The neighbouring barbaric peoples were imbued with the same ideas as the Chaldeans regarding the constitution of the world and the nature of the laws which governed it. They lived likewise in perpetual fear of those invisible beings whose changeable and arbitrary will actuated all visible phenomena. They attributed all the reverses and misfortunes which overtook them to the direct action of these malevolent beings. They believed firmly in the influence of the stars on the course of events. They were constantly on the lookout for prodigies, and were greatly alarmed by them, since they had no certain knowledge of the number and nature of their enemies, and the means they had invented for protecting themselves from these, or of overcoming them, too often proved inefficient. In the eyes of these barbarians, the Chaldeans seemed to be possessed of the very powers which they themselves lacked. The magicians of Chaldea had forced the demons to obey them, and to unmask themselves before them. They read with ease in the heavens the present and future of men and nations. They interpreted the will of the immortals in its smallest manifestations, and with them this faculty was not a limited and ephemeral power, quickly exhausted by use. The rites and formulas known to them enabled them to exercise it freely at all times, in all places, alike upon the most exalted of the gods and the most dreaded of mortals, without its ever becoming weakened. A race so endowed with wisdom was, indeed, destined to triumph over its neighbours, and the latter would have no chance of resisting such a nation unless they borrowed from it its manners, customs, industry, writing, and all the arts and sciences which had brought about their superiority. Chaldaean civilization spread into Elam and took possession of the inhabitants of the shores of the Persian Gulf, and then, since its course was impeded on the south by the sea, on the west by the desert, and on the east by the mountains, it turned in the direction of the great northern plains and proceeded up the two rivers, beside whose lower waters it had been cradled. It was at this very time that the pharaohs of the 13th dynasty had just completed the conquest of Nubia. Greater Egypt, made what she was by the efforts of 20 generations, had become an African power. The sea formed her northern boundary, the desert and the mountains enclosed her on all sides, and the Nile appeared the only natural outlet into a new world. She followed it indefatigably from one cataract to another, colonizing as she passed all the lands fertilized by its waters. Every step which she made in this direction increased the distance between her capitals and the Mediterranean, and brought her armies further south. Asia would have practically ceased to exist, as far as Egypt was concerned, had not the repeated incursions of the Bedouin obliged her to make advances from time to time in that direction. Still, she crossed the frontier as seldom as possible, and recalled her troops as soon as they had reduced the marauders to order. Ethiopia alone attracted her, and it was there that she firmly established her empire. The two great civilized peoples of the ancient world, therefore, had each their field of action clearly marked out, and neither of them had ever ventured into that of the other. There had been no lack of intercourse between them; if it ever really had taken place, had been accidental, had merely produced passing results, and up till then had terminated without bringing to either side a decisive advantage. End of Section 41. Read by Professor Heather and By. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Section 42 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 3 by Gaston MASPERO. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Appendix. Pharonic lists. The pharaohs of the ancient and middle empires, dynasties 1 through 14. The lists of the pharaohs of the Memphite period appear to have been drawn up in much the same order as we now possess them, as early as the 12th dynasty. It is certain that the sequence was definitely fixed about the time of the 20th dynasty, since it was under this that the canon of Turin was copied. The lists which have come down to us appear to follow two traditions, which differ completely in certain cases. One has been preserved for us by the abbreviators of Manetho, while the other was the authority followed by the compilers of the tables of Abydos and Saqqara, as well as by the author of the Turin Papyrus. There appear to have been in the first 5 dynasties a certain number of kings whose exact order and filiation were supposed to be well known to the compilers, but at the same time there were others whose names were found on the monuments, but whose position with regard to their predecessors was indicated neither by historical documents nor by popular romance. We find, therefore, in these two traditional lists a series of sovereigns always occupying the same position, and others hovering around them who have no decided place. The hieroglyphic lists and the royal canon appear to have been chiefly concerned with the former, but the authorities followed by Manetho have studiously collected the names of the latter, and have intercalated them in different places, sometimes in the middle, but mostly at the end of the dynasty, where they form a kind of caput mortuum. The most striking example of this arrangement is afforded to us in the 4th dynasty. The contemporary monuments show that its kings formed a compact group, to which are appended the first 3 sovereigns of the 5th dynasty, always in the same order. Menkaure succeeded Khafre, Shopsiskaf followed Menkaure, Userkaf followed Shopsiskaf, and so on to the end. The lists of Manetho suppress Shopsiskaf, and substitute 4 other individuals in his place, namely Katoisis, Bekhiris, Siberkaris, Thamsis, whose reigns must have occupied more than half a century. These 4 were doubtless aspirants to the throne, or local kings belonging to the time between the 4th and 5th dynasties, whom Manetho's authorities inserted between the compact groups made up of Cheops and his sons on the one hand, and of Userkaf and his 2 real or supposed brothers on the other, omitting Shopsiskaf, and having no idea that Userkaf was his immediate successor, with or without rivals to the throne. In a course of lectures given at the Collège de France, 1893 1895, I have examined at length the questions raised by a study of the various lists, and I may be able, perhaps, some day to publish the result of my researches. For the present, I must confine myself merely to what is necessary to the elucidation of the present work, namely, the Manethonian tradition on the one hand, and the tradition of the monumental tables on the other. The text which I propose to follow for the latter, during the first 5 dynasties, is that of the second table of Abydos. The names placed between brackets are taken either from the table of Saqqara or from the royal canon of Turin. The numbers of the years, months, and days are those furnished by the last mentioned document. From the 6th to the 12th dynasty, the lists of Manetho are at fault. They give the origin and duration of the dynasties, without furnishing us with the names of the kings. This blank is partially filled by the table of Abydos, by the fragments of the Turin Papyrus, and by information supplied by the monuments. No such definitely established sequence appears to have existed for this period as for the preceding ones. The Heracleopolitan dynasties figure, perhaps, in the canon of Turin only. As for the later Memphite dynasties, the table of Abydos gives one series of pharaohs, while the canon adopts a different one. After the close of the 6th dynasty, and before the accession of the 9th, there was doubtless a period when several branches of the royal family claimed the supremacy and ruled in different parts of Egypt, This is what we know to have taken place later between the 22nd and the 24th dynasties. The tradition of Abydos had, perhaps, adopted one of these contemporaneous dynasties, while the Turin Papyrus had chosen another. Manetho, on the other hand, had selected from among them, as representatives of the legitimate succession, the line reigning at Memphis which immediately followed the sovereigns of the 6th dynasty. The following table gives both the series known, as far as it is possible for the present to re establish the order. The 11th Theban dynasty contains but a small number of kings according to the official lists. The tables on the monuments recognize only two, Nibkhurri and Sankhkari, but the Turin canon admits at least half a dozen. These differences probably arose from the fact that the second Heracleopolitan dynasty having reigned at the same time as the earlier Theban princes, the tables on the monuments, while rejecting the Heracleopolitans, recognized as legitimate pharaohs only those of the Theban kings who had ruled over the whole of Egypt, namely, the first and last of the series. The canon, on the contrary, replaced the later Heracleopolitans by those among the contemporary Thebans who had assumed the royal titles. Whatever may have been the cause of these combinations, we find the lists again harmonizing with the accession of the 12th Theban dynasty. For the succeeding dynasties we possess merely the names enumerated on the fragments of the Turin Papyrus, several of which, however, are also found either on the royal chamber at Karnak or on contemporary monuments. The order of the names is not always certain; it is, perhaps, best to transcribe the sequence as we are able to gather it from the fragments of the royal papyrus, without attempting to distinguish between those which belong to the 13th, and those which must be relegated to the following dynasties. About 50 names still remain, but so mutilated and scattered over such small fragments of papyrus that their order is most uncertain. We possess monuments of about 1/5 of these kings, and the lengths of their reigns. As far as we know them, all appear to have been short. We have no reason to doubt that they did really govern, and we can only hope that in time the progress of excavation will yield us records of them one after another. They bring us down to the period of the invasion of the shepherds, and it is possible that some among them may be found to be contemporaries of the 15th and 16th dynasties. End of Section 42. End of Volume 3 of the History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria by Gaston Maspero. Read by Professor Heather Mbai in Carrollton, Georgia, in December 2009. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.